Hello and welcome everyone. Today we begin with session 2 that we have module 2 which deals with basics of remote sensing. So moving on, what is remote sensing? Remote sensing is the science and to some extent an art also of acquiring information about the earth's surface without actually being in contact with it. Now, this is done generally by sensing and recording the reflected or emitted energy and processing, analyzing, and applying that information. So you can see in over here that there's a satellite that moves around the earth, all around the earth, and it moves in a specific direction. It moves with a specific width, that covers a specific width of the circle, and that is nothing but acquiring the information of the earth's surface without actually coming in physical contact with it. In much of the remote sensing, the process involves an interaction between the incident ray and the targets of interest. Using various sensors, the data is then collected remotely that may be analyzed to obtain information about the objects, the areas, or the phenomena being investigated. The remotely collected data can be of many forms, including variations in force distribution, acoustic wave distributions, or electromagnetic energy distributions. Remote sensing is exemplified by the use of imaging systems where the following seven elements play a very vital role. These seven elements are first one, these energy source or the illumination. Now, you need something to illuminate the target, so that is either the sun, or else there's a sensor that sends rays towards the object, where the object is then radiates it back to the sensor so that their images or their information can be stored. So that source of illumination is required, which we in simple terms call it as the energy source that lightens up or provides the electromagnetic energy to the target of interest. The second important element, the second of the seven elements that we have, is the radiation and the atmosphere, which is B, which is depicted in this image. As the energy is traveling from the source to the target, and it will come in contact with, and it will interact with the atmosphere because it is passing through the atmosphere. So that interaction will take place first time, that time when it is entering the atmosphere and moving towards the target. Second time it will interact with atmosphere when from the target it is going towards the sensor. So there are two times where this energy is interacting with the atmosphere, and when it interacts with the atmosphere, there's some or the other kind of phenomena that takes place, which leads to either better storage, or it leads to proper storage of information of that object, or some distorted problems. The next of the seven element that comes in is C in this, the alphabet C in this image, which is interaction with the target. Now, once the energy uh, it makes way through the atmosphere, it comes and hits the target. It hits the target. Here it interacts with the target. Either a part of it is absorbed, either the whole amount is given out. All given out as in it is radiated back to the sensor. It all depends on the target properties. That interaction will help further to give us the information or store the information in the sensor in the form of some dn values, which will then be converted to images. The next of the seven element that comes in is the recording of energy by the sensor. That is the sensor itself, which is the alphabet D in this image. It is after the energy that has been that has interacted with the target, and now is again going back to the sensor. In that case, when it is going back to the sensor, it again interacts with the atmosphere, and after that interaction, maybe scattering, that reaches the sensor. The sensor has to be there to collect that electromagnetic radiation. If the sensor cannot collect that electromagnetic radiation, it becomes difficult. It is impossible to store the data and produce it as an image. So hence that sensor there is required to collect and record the electromagnetic radiation. The next element that comes in is the transmission, reception, and processing, which is element E in the given image. The energy recorded by the sensor has to be transmitted in the electronic form to a receiving and processing station, where the data which is taken up, which is recorded by the sensor, will be processed further in the form of an image, which will be given either as a hard copy or a digital copy to the users. Next comes the interpretation and analysis, where the processed image is being interpreted visually and or digitally or electronically to extract information about the target, which was illuminated further in the past, the information of the object. Lastly comes its application, which is nothing but the final element of the remote sensing process, which is achieved when we apply the information that we are able to extract from the image about the target for better understanding, revealing some new information, and or assisting in certain problem solving issues. So knowing the information of one object will help me to solve a problem. Maybe if I want to solve certain transportation problems, so that way the image can be used for network analysis. So that kind of analysis can be done, which is application, which becomes the last element of the remote sensing process. This brings us to electromagnetic radiation. Now, all this while I have been trying to explain that when it comes to remote sensing, when it comes to acquiring information of an object, I need certain medium through which the information um, can be transferred from the object to the sensor, and that medium is nothing but the electromagnetic radiation. The first requirement of remote sensing is to have an energy source so that they can illuminate the target, as in glow up the target, and that can be done through electromagnetic radiation. This radiation consists of the electrical field and the magnetic field, and the speed here is the speed of both the fields is at the speed of light. You can see here in the image, the electric field varies in magnitude in the direction perpendicular to the direction in which the radiation is traveling, and the magnetic field is oriented at the right angles to the electrical field. Both these fields travel at the speed of light. So it's the electrical field and the magnetic field traveling at the speed of light, which is the whole concept of the electromagnetic radiation. There are two characteristics of this radiation, which is particularly in terms of the wavelength and the frequency. The wavelength is the length of one wave cycle, which can be measured as the distance between the successive wave crests. So you can see in the image here, the first image that you can see there are two crests. This is one crest, and this is two crest, and this is the third one. So this is one, this is one, this is two, and this is three. So wavelength is nothing but the distance between two wave crests. It is usually represented by the Greek letter, we call it as lambda. Frequency is the number of cycles of wave passing a fixed point per unit of time. So see, here you see the distance to be less, here you see the distance to be more. Here you see the distance to be more, here you see the distance to be less. This, what does this imply? This implies that the frequency for the second one, is more than the frequency for the first one. The frequency of the first one is more than the frequency of the third one. So, what we can derive from here is that the wavelength and frequency are inversely proportional to each other. Wavelength more, frequency less, wavelength less, frequency more. So, both of these are inversely related to each other. Electromagnetic spectrum is nothing but a group of a number of wavelengths of waves, a number of waves together, which can be in terms of shorter wavelengths or longer wavelengths, and the whole electromagnetic spectrum can be used for remote sensing, or it can be used for deriving information of the earth's surface. So the electromagnetic spectrum ranges from the shorter wavelengths, including the gamma and the X-rays, to the longer wavelengths, which includes the microwave and the broadcast radio waves. These electromagnetic spectrum together, all these waves together, which forms individual regions all together coming as electromagnetic spectrum, is useful for remote sensing. The first segment of the electromagnetic spectrum is the ultraviolet or the UV portion of the spectrum, which is the shortest wavelength, which are practical for remote sensing. This radiation is just beyond the violet portion of the visible wavelength, and hence its name is ultraviolet. Some of the Earth's surface materials, majorly the rocks and minerals, they emit visible light when illuminated by the UV radiation. So this can be used in remote sensing also. The second part of the electromagnetic spectrum comes as the visible spectrum. The visible spectrum is what our eyes can detect. To be in very to tell you in very simple terms, it's only the rays that our eyes can detect. So it majorly consists of three ways, which is the uh, blue, red and green majorly. Then there are combinations. So the longest wavelength is the red, and the shortest is the violet, which ranges from 0.4 to 0.7. This is the part, this is the most common wavelength parts that are being used, with particular colors from the visible portion, which are violet, blue, green, yellow, orange and red. So violet is from 0.4 to 0.446, blue is from 0.446 to 0.5, green is from 0.5 to 0.7, and so on till red, which is from 0.620 to 0.7. The next part, or the next portion of the spectrum of interest that we have, is the infrared region, which covers a wavelength which is approximately from 0.7 to 100, or in fact at times it goes more than 100 also. This infrared region can be divided into two major categories, which is the reflected infrared, and the second one is the emitted or the thermal infrared. The radiation in the reflected infrared region is used for remote sensing purposes in various ways, very similar to that of our visible portion. Whereas the thermal region is quite different from that of the visible and the reflected infrared portions, because this thermal infrared energy is essentially the radiation that is emitted from the earth's surface in the form of heat. The wavelength here is from 3.0 to 100. The next part of this spectrum that is the area of interest for remote sensing, which is a more recent development in remote sensing, is the microwave region, which is from 1 millimeter to 1 meter and it covers the longest wavelengths that is being used in remote sensing. The shorter wavelengths have properties similar to the thermal infrared region, while the longer wavelengths in the microwave region um, approach the wavelengths which are used for radio broadcast. Because of the special nature of this region, its importance to remote sensing is increasing day by day. It's rapidly growing. Coming on to the second element that we were discussing of the remote sensing process, which is the interaction of this electromagnetic radiation with the atmosphere, which is the B part in the diagram we had seen before also. Before the radiation is used for remote sensing reaches the Earth's surface, it has to travel and pass through the atmosphere. Here in atmosphere, it there are several processes that takes place. There are several interactions of this electromagnetic spectrum in the atmosphere, and the mechanism through which the interaction takes place are two. One is scattering. The second one is absorption. Scattering is nothing but when it occurs when the particles or large gas molecules present in the atmosphere interact with and cause the electromagnetic radiation to be redirected from its original path. How much of scattering takes place will depend on several factors, including the wavelength of the radiation, the abundance of particles or gases, and the distance the radiation travels through the atmosphere. There are three types of scattering that we have. The first one we call it as Mie scattering. Mie scattering occurs when particles are just about the same size as the wavelength of the radiation. So the dust, pollen, smoke, water vapor, these are major components in the atmosphere that cause the Mie scattering, which tends to affect the longer wavelengths than those uh, affected by the Rayleigh scattering, which we will talk later. Mie scattering occurs mostly in the lower portions of the atmosphere where larger particles are abundant and dominates when cloud conditions are overcast. So, one, Mie scattering occurs when the particle size is of the same as the wavelength of the radiation. Two, they occur majorly in the lower sections of the atmosphere. And three, Mie scattering dominates when cloud conditions are overcast. The second type of scattering that we have is the Rayleigh scattering, when the particle size are small compared to the wavelength of the radiation. So majorly, the small specks of dust or nitrogen or oxygen molecules are the ones that cause this kind of scattering. Rayleigh scattering causes shorter wavelengths of energy to be scattered more than the longer wavelengths. It is a dominant scattering mechanism in the upper atmosphere. The fact that the sky is the fact that the sky appears blue during the day is only because of this Rayleigh scattering. What happens is, as the sunlight passes through the atmosphere, the shorter wavelengths, which is the blue region of the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible spectrum of the EMR, is scattered more than the longer ones. So hence it appears to be blue. At sunrise and sunset, the light has to travel further to the atmosphere than at the midday, and the scattering of the shorter wavelengths is more complete. This leaves greater proportion of the longer wavelengths to penetrate the atmosphere. So from the conclusion of the whole thing is, you need to remember that Rayleigh scattering is happening when the particle size is smaller than that of the wavelength of the radiation, and it is more dominant in the upper atmosphere, and it causes the shorter wavelengths to be scattered more than the longer ones. These are three important things that you need to remember. One example of this Rayleigh scattering will be the blue color that you see in the atmosphere during the day is only because of this Rayleigh scattering. The third type of scattering that we have is the non-selective scattering. This non-selective scattering takes place when the particle size is much larger than the wavelength of the radiation. So there are certain water droplets or large dust particles that will cause this kind of non-selective scattering. This type of scattering causes fogs and clouds to appear white to our eyes because blue, green, and red are all scattered approximately in equal quantities. So when this visible spectrum is being, I should say, scattered in equal quantities, we get something white, and that white is, fog is white, clouds are white. So that's how we can see the clouds and fogs to be white in color because of the non-selective scattering. The next mechanism of interaction with the atmosphere, as I had told you earlier, is the absorption. Now, absorption is another main mechanism at work when electromagnetic radiation interacts with the atmosphere. This phenomena causes molecules in the atmosphere to absorb energy at various wavelengths. The ozone layer, the carbon dioxide, water vapor, these are three major components of atmosphere that absorb the radiation. One important and practical consequence of the interaction of electromagnetic radiation with matter and of the detailed composition of our atmosphere is that only light in certain wavelength regions can penetrate the atmosphere well. And these areas we call it as atmospheric windows. In short, I should tell you, atmospheric windows is nothing but areas from where this electromagnetic radiation directly reaches the target without any absorption or any scattering happening. Okay, so when the electromagnetic radiation directly reaches the target without absorption or scattering, that area in the atmosphere we call it as atmospheric windows. There's another concept related to absorption, which is half absorption, where altitude is being defined to the altitude at the atmosphere where half of the radiation of the given wavelength in the upper atmosphere is being absorbed. So half absorption, as the name suggests, only half of the radiated electromagnetic radiation is being absorbed and the other half passes away. So that is half absorption. Windows correspond to those regions where half absorption altitude is very, very small. So when it comes to interactions in the atmosphere, there are two ways through which interaction takes place. One is absorption, the other one is scattering. Scattering are of three types: Mie, Rayleigh, and non-selective, whereas absorption is done through elements like ozone, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. And with that, we also studied what are atmospheric windows and half absorption. After all this that has happened in the atmosphere, the third thing that comes in is the interaction with the earth surface, that is interaction with the target. Now, radiation that is not absorbed or which is not scattered in the atmosphere comes and reaches the target, and it interacts with the target and interacts with the earth surface. There are three ways how it interacts. One is absorption, two is transmission, and three is reflection. The total incident energy which will interact with the surface in one or more of these three ways, the total energy that is coming through the atmosphere after scattering and absorption, comes and reaches and will interact with the target in either of these three waves. Absorption occurs when the radiation is absorbed by the target. Transmission occurs when the radiation passes through the target. So there's absorption. Two, one, it just passes through. That is known as transmission. Three is reflection. Now, this is where remote sensing plays a very important role. This is where reflection will definitely help for acquiring the information. So reflection occurs when radiation bounces off the target and is redirected. In remote sensing, we are actually interested in this reflected radiation. There are two types of reflections. One is specular reflection, one is diffuse reflection. The image here itself, is very clear as to what specular, what diffuse reflection is. Specular reflection, you can see that all that energy which is coming in and hitting that road is reflected back in the same direction, in a single direction. That is what we call as specular or mirror like reflection. The second image that is given, which is diffuse reflection. Now, in case of a tree, in that case, as the image tells us, there's radiation coming in. That radiation, when it hits that tree, is reflected back in various directions. When it's reflected back in the uh, various directions, we call it as diffuse reflection. Whether a particular targets reflects specularly or diffusely or somewhere in between depends on the surface roughness of that feature in comparison to the wavelength of the incoming radiation. If the wavelengths are much smaller than the surface variations or the particle size that make up the surface, diffuse reflection will dominate. If the wavelengths are of smaller size than that of the surface variations or the particle sizes, diffuse reflection will dominate. For example, fine grained sand would appear fairly smooth to long wave microwaves but would appear quite rough to the visible wavelengths. So, whether it be diffuse, whether it be specular, whether it be in that case mirror like, you have all that will determine the interaction, sorry, it will determine the characteristics of the target. Once that is reflected back, it reaches the sensor, it reaches the instrument which captures this energy. That's how data is then acquired. So, bringing us to the next step of remote sensing, which is data acquisition. The remote sensing instrument measures the energy which is being reflected back by the target, which it receives from the target. There are three useful areas of the spectrum which best gives the characteristic or the information of the target. One is the visible, near, and the mid infrared region. Here you have two, passive and active sensors, where passive is just one that does not have its own illuminating energy. It just receives what the target is radiating, and active is nothing but it sends a um, kind of illuminating energy towards the target, and then it receives the reflected radiation. So there's passive and active sensors in that case. The second one that you have is thermal infrared, where the energy is measured in terms of the temperature of the surface and its emissivity. Then you have the microwave, again, where you have the active and the passive microwave region, where the active one is pulse transmitted, measure the amount scattered back, and it is the same like the passive sensors. It does not send any kind of illuminating energy, whereas, sorry, the passive ones, the active ones, they do send their own illuminating energies, through which then the amount which is scattered back is again captured. The passive microwave region is the emitted energy at the shorter end of the microwave spectrum. This brings us to major, the receiving remote sensing instruments, which we call it as sensors, which are of two types. They are passive sensors and active sensors. Now, both of them are important. Depending upon which area of which image you want, which area has to be covered in the image, as well as what time of the day or the night you are using this remote sensing technique will determine will define whether you have to use a passive sensor or you have to use a active sensor. Passive sensors, the sun provides a very convenient source of energy for remote sensing. The sun's energy is either reflected at as it is for visible wavelengths, or is absorbed and then re-emitted as of the thermal infrared wavelengths. Remote sensing systems which measure the energy that is naturally available is known as passive sensors. They can only be used to detect energy when the naturally occurring energy is available. For all reflected energy, this can only take place during the time when the sun is illuminating the earth. There is no reflected energy available from the sun at night. Definitely we don't see the sun at the night, so definitely we cannot use passive sensors at night. The energy that is naturally emitted, like that of thermal infrared, can be detected day or night as long as the amount of energy is large enough to be recorded. At times, the energy that is reflected back by the target is enough for recording, then it is fine. But if it's not enough, then you need something for illuminating that object or that surface. For that, what has come in is active sensors. Now, active sensors have their own energy, they have their own energy source of illumination. It will send a radiation towards the target that has to be investigated. That target will interact with the radiation sent. The reflected radiation is then given back to the sensor, or sent back to the sensor from the target, which is then measured by the sensor. The only advantage of active sensors is you can use them any time of the day, regardless it being day or night, or regardless being any season. Active sensors can be used for examining wavelengths that are not sufficiently provided by the sun, such as the microwaves, or to better control the way a target is illuminated. The best example that I can give you will be a synthetic aperture radar, or in that case, I can give you radar itself is a very is the most used active sensor today. There are certain satellite characteristics which we generally call in terms of the orbit and the swath, which is required when it comes to remote sensing. A sensor is always on a platform. That platform can be a ground based, or it can be aircraft based, or it can be satellite based. So generally, remote sensing nowadays, if you see, is more with satellite imageries. So that is why it comes as, uh, you know, uh, the sensors are generally seen in these satellites, and that's why we call it as satellite characteristics. Okay. Now these satellites with the sensors, they follow a particular path when it comes to the Earth. Now, satellites, they are, about at times 11,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, at times 36,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, depending upon what kind of satellite it is. So, when it is at that height, at that away from the Earth's surface, it follows a continuous path, and it moves around the Earth in a continuous path. That path of the satellite, we call it as orbit. It's a similar way of, like the Earth. The Earth is revolving around the sun in a fixed orbit. Similarly, satellite is revolving around the Earth in a fixed orbit, in a fixed path, which we call it as orbit. Satellite orbits are matched to the capability and objective of the sensor they carry. Orbit selection can vary in terms of altitude, their orientation, and rotation relative to the Earth. Satellites, as I told you, are at a very high altitude, which view the same portion of the Earth's surface at all times, have geostationary orbits. So there are certain satellites that are fixed, at one position. So when they are fixed at one position, just looking into, just one portion of the Earth's surface, we call it as geostationary satellites, and they have geostationary orbits. So, fixed in one position, as in it will revolve around the Earth, and uh, it will just take the image of one area. It will not take the image of one, path, just one area, focusing on only, say, Sri Lanka. Then it will only focus on Sri Lanka, it will not give any other image. So those are known as geostationary satellites, which and their orbits are known as geostationary orbits. Many remote sensing platforms are designed to follow an orbit, basically, which is north and south orbit, in conjunction with the Earth's rotation, which is west to east. And this allows them to cover most of the Earth's surface over a certain period of time. These are different types, which is continuously moving up and down, up and down, up and down. So it moves from, say, north to south, and then again south to north, again north to south, and south to north. That kind of satellites are different than the geostationary satellites. These are near polar orbits, so named for the inclination of the orbit relative to a line running between north and south poles. Most of these satellite orbits are also sun synchronous, such that they cover each area of the world at a constant local time of the day, called local sun time. Let's make it more simple for you. These satellites that are moving, they keep on moving, they are taking images of different parts of the Earth. So from north to south they come down, and then again they move on from south to north. These satellites are known as sun synchronous satellites, and their orbits are known as sun synchronous orbits. Most of the remote sensing satellite platforms today are in near polar orbits, that is, they are sun synchronous orbits, which means that the satellite travels northwards from one side of the Earth and then moves towards the south pole in the second half of its orbit. These are known as ascending and descending passes. Ascending passes and descending passes. From north to south, descending. From south to north, ascending. Active sensors, which provide their own illumination, or passive sensors that record emitted radiation, can also image the surface on the ascending passes. As a satellite revolves around the Earth, the sensor sees a certain portion of the Earth's surface. That seen portion of the Earth, we call it as swath. So in this image, if you see this part, at one particular time the sensor is only seeing this part. So this part is known as swath. This gray whole patch is nothing but the ascending or the descending path of the satellite. It's the orbit of the satellite. The imaging swath or spaceborne sensors generally vary between tens and hundreds of kilometers wide. As the satellite orbits the Earth from pole to pole, its east-west position wouldn't change if the Earth didn't rotate. However, as seen from the Earth, it seems that the satellite is shifting westward because the Earth is rotating beneath it. This apparent movement allows the satellite swath to cover a new area with a consecutive pass. So, in short, you just need to remember that if the Earth wasn't rotating and the satellites were moving, it would have moved only in one path. Correct? So, the other paths would not have been imaged. But since the Earth is rotating, it helps the satellite to cover all the areas of the Earth's surface to be imaged. So it's not only one particular swath, but it also is the consecutive passes that can be imaged. If we start with any randomly selected pass in a satellite's orbit, an orbit cycle will be completed when the satellite retraces its path, passing over the same point on the Earth's surface directly below the satellite. We call that, for the second time, we call that to be the nadir point. So see, the satellite is moving, and then it moves to a consecutive pass, and then another pass, and then another pass, and that way, when it again comes back to the same orbit and the same point for the second time, we call it as the nadir point. The exact length of time of the orbital cycle will vary for each and every satellite. The interval of time required for the satellite to complete its orbit cycle is not the same as its revisit period. The revisit period is an important consideration for a number of monitoring applications, especially when it comes change detection, especially when it comes to having um, studies related to change directions. Say forested area. So if I want to map forested area from 2009 to 19, satellite revisit periods become very important, because 2009 the satellite had imaged, 2019 also the satellite had imaged. Now it is easier for me to actually see the extent of say the forest destruction or the forest increase in that scale. Or in that case, see, this was a very large time period that I told you, 2009 and 19. But if I have to give you a very for a shorter time period, maybe an oil spill, an oil spill nearly 4 to 5 days you can have an oil spill. So in the first day, it took an image of the oil spill. Then, by the time it came back to the same position in its revisit period, we saw that the oil spill has increased, or it has either increased or it has either decreased. So monitoring that spread, looking for the extent of the flooding that is taking place in a certain area, all this can be done only because the satellite revisits. It has a revisit period. The near polar orbit In the near polar orbits, areas at higher altitudes will be imaged more frequently than the equatorial zones due to the increasing overlap in adjacent swaths as the orbit paths become closer to the poles. We all know that the poles, the longitudes are meeting towards the poles. It's the same concept of the longitudes. You move towards you from 0 degree longitude, you come down, okay, then 1 degree longitude you come. It's the distance between two longitudes near the poles is will be less, as well as in the near the equator it will be more, because of the shape. Similarly, when it comes to satellites, they are also following these oval orbits, and these oval orbits will be tapering towards the pole and more wider towards the equator. So what happens, the areas near the poles will be imaged the more number of times than the ones in the equator. There are certain satellite orbital characteristics that we need to be clear. One is the altitude. Now, altitude is nothing but the distance from the satellite to the mean surface level of the Earth. The satellite altitude influences the spatial resolution at a very large extent. We will talk about spatial resolution later. Then we have the inclination angle. The inclination angle is the angle between the orbit and the equator. The inclination angle of the orbit determines the field of view of the sensor and which latitude can be observed. The period. The period is the time in minutes required to complete one full orbit. A polar satellite orbiting at an altitude of 800 kilometers has a period of about 90 minutes. The repeat cycle is the time in days required, or the time in days between two successive identical orbits. This brings us to certain resolutions that are important in the images acquired through remote sensing. Those resolutions will determine the pixel size, it will determine the scale of the image. So, the first resolution that we come to is the spatial resolution. The distance between the target that is being imaged and the platform plays a very important role in determining the detail of the information obtained and the total area imaged by the sensor. Sensors on board platforms far away from their targets typically view a larger area but cannot provide greater detail. Spatial resolution of passive sensors depend primarily on something known as the IFOV, which is instantaneous field of view. It is the angular cone of visibility of a sensor and determines the area on the surface which is seen from a given altitude at a particular moment in a particular time. So, say at 10 a.m., this aircraft is viewing this B part of the Earth's surface. So, this B is nothing but IFOV. Are we clear with that? Hopefully, I am. This area on the ground is called the resolution cell and determines a sensor's maximum spatial resolution. So, this rectangle which has been formed here, this, whether it is covering 30 meters, whether it is covering 1 kilometer, whether it is covering 10 meters, is nothing but the spatial resolution of the image, because that is 1 pixel. So pixels are nothing but the smallest unit of an image. Image pixels are normally square and represent a certain area on an image. It is important to distinguish between pixel size and spatial resolution, which are not interchangeable. Um, yes, there's a difference between pixel size and spatial resolution. If a sensor has a spatial resolution of 20 meters and an image from that sensor is displayed at full resolution, each pixel represents an area of 20 into 20 meters on the ground. In this case, pixel size and resolution are same. Images where only large features are visible are said to have a coarse or a low resolution. In fine or high resolution images, small objects can be detected. So, lesser the resolution, see, 20-meter resolution will give me information, but 10-meter resolution will give me better information. It gives me better detailing of the target. Okay, so let's imagine the first image here is at, say, let's assume it to be 50-meter resolution and this one to be at 20-meter resolution. Okay, so the first one will give me an idea that okay, there's a river passing by and there's high density areas here, but the roads seem to be of the equal of the equal width, and it just shows me the pattern of settlements and it shows me which area is greener, like more trees, less density, all that. But the next image that we have is more clearer, where one road width is more than the other one. I can see the number of cars being parked here. I can see the shape of the building over here. I can see that this is green, this is forested area, but this is high tree density area. But with that, in certain part, it is a bit more, barren in that case. So that is clearer with a resolution with lower number. So it is not that 20-meter resolution is a high resolution. No, the lower the number, higher the resolution. Higher the number, lower the resolution. So 50 meter will for us will be a low resolution, whereas 10 meter will be a high resolution image. So it's inversely proportional. Commercial satellites provide imagery with resolutions varying from a few meters to several kilometers. Generally speaking, the finer the resolution, the less ground area can be seen. The ratio of distance of an image or a map to the actual ground distance is referred to as the scale. It is the same, this concept of scale is same as that we had discussed for a map. You know, the ratio of distance between 2 points on a map or an image to the same 2 points on the actual ground is referred to as scale. So if you have a map with a scale of 1 is to 1 lakh, say, an object of 1 centimeter length on the map would actually be 1 lakh centimeters on the ground. Like that's what we have seen in the earlier session also of maps, where we said that yes, 1 centimeter is equal to, say, whatever the scale is, 1 lakh or 25,000 or 250,000 centimeters on the ground. So resolution here, when it comes to spatial resolution, is in terms of whether it is high resolution, then it is 10 meters, 5 meters, 15 meters. If it's a lower resolution, then it is, maybe 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers in that sense. The next type of resolution that we come across will be the spectral resolution. The spectral response and the spectral emissivity curves characterize the reflectance or emittance of a feature or a target over variety of wavelengths. Different classes of features and details in an image can often be distinguished by comparing the responses over distinct wavelength ranges. Broad classes like water and vegetation can usually be separated by using broad wavelength ranges. But when it comes to other classes, if you want more specific classes such as different rock types, that may not be easy with broad wavelength ranges, for which we require much finer ranges to separate. Thus, we could require a sensor with high spectral resolution. Spectral resolution describes actually the ability of the sensor to define fine wavelength intervals. The finer the spectral resolution, the narrower the wavelength range for a particular channel or a band. Example for this will be the same example I will take is a rock. Now, rock consists of a variety of minerals, correct? Those minerals will have their own characteristics of absorbing or reflecting the amount of energy. Depending upon the reflected energy, whether the sensor can determine the fine changes in the wavelengths, then it has higher spectral resolution. If it cannot, then it is lower spectral resolution. Black and white film records wavelengths extending over much or all of the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's the spectral resolution. If the its spectral resolution is fairly coarse and it is more of the broader wavelengths that are being captured. Color film is also sensitive to reflective energy over the visible portion of the spectrum, but has higher spectral resolution as finer wavelengths of the blue, green, and red can be captured. Thus, it can represent features of various colors based on the reflectance in each of the distinct wavelength range. Many remote sensing systems record energy over several separate wavelengths ranging at various spectral resolutions. These are referred to as multispectral sensors and will be described, which we will see in the following sections in the following PPT further on. Advanced multispectral sensors, they are called as hyperspectral sensors, which can detect hundreds of very fine and narrow wavelengths, spectral bands. throughout the visible, the near infrared, and the mid infrared portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. They Their very high spectral resolution facilitates finer discrimination between the different targets on the Earth's surface based on the spectral response of the target to the narrow bands of the wavelengths. So, in short, spectral resolution is nothing but the ability of the sensor to detect very fine wavelengths. If it can detect very fine wavelengths, we call it as high spectral resolution. If it cannot, we call it as low spectral resolution. The third type of resolution that comes in is the radiometric resolution. Radiometric resolution is another important factor that has to be looked into when it comes to remote sensing process. You know, while the arrangement of pixels describe the spatial structure of the image, the radiometric characteristics are described by the actual information content of the image. Every time an image is acquired by the sensor, its sensitivity to the magnitude of the electromagnetic energy determines the or detects the radiometric resolution. The radiometric resolution of an imaging system describes the ability to discriminate very slight, even if there's a slight differences in energy, that can be described in the radiometric resolution. Finer radiometric resolution of the sensor, more sensitive to detecting smaller changes. If it's coarse radiometric resolution, then it's not that sensitive. Imagery data that are represented by positive digital numbers, which vary from 0 to 1 less than a selected power of 2. This range corresponds to the number of bits used for coding numbers in the binary format. Um, we always generally say, it's a 8-bit image, it is a 16-bit image. So this, helps us to know what the radiometric resolution is. Okay, if I'm using a sensor with 8-bit, it can record almost 256 digital values. So it will range from 0 to 255, because I'm counting 0, so I will take in 255. If it's a 4-bit sensor, then it is, just 16 digital values, so it's from 0 to 15. So if it's a 4-bit, it is, the resolution is less. If it's an 8-bit, the resolution is high, because see the number 255, nearly 256 digital values, it can differentiate, whereas here it is only 15. So definitely my smaller changes of in the target can be detected in the 8-bit sensor. So radiometric resolution is higher for my 8-bit sensor than for a 4-bit sensor. By comparing a 2-bit image with an 8-bit image, we can see that there is a large difference in the level of detail that is being captured of for the target. This brings us to the last type of resolution that we have, which is the temporal resolution. It is also considered to be a very important phenomena for remote sensing, especially because it considers the revisit period of the satellite. So the revisit period of the satellite sensor is usually in several days. Therefore, the absolute temporal resolution of a remote sensing system to image the exact same area of the same viewing angle the second time is equal to this period. So for simple terms, um, let's take up one point. It starts from this A point. From this A point, it moves. Okay, so it's moving this way, and then it comes back. Then it goes to a second path. then it goes to the third path, it goes to the fourth path, and so on, covers the whole earth, and then it comes back to the same point, same viewing angle for the second time, is considered to be the temporal resolution. However, because of some degrees of overlap in imaging swaths of adjacent orbits for most satellites, and the increase in this overlap with increasing latitude, some areas of the Earth tend to be re-imaged more frequently than the other areas. Like we said before also, near the poles, the swath is tapering, and hence areas near the pole will be imaged more than the areas near the equator. Also, some satellite systems are able to point the sensors to image the same area between different satellite passes separated by periods from 1 to 5 days. Thus, the actual temporal resolution of the sensor depends on a variety of factors, including the satellite and the sensor capabilities, the swath overlap, and the latitude. The ability to collect imagery of the same area of the Earth's surface at different periods of time is one of the most important elements for applying remote sensing data. Like we've been discussing, um, to see the spread of oil spill, or to see the extent of flooding, all that will help only when the satellite revisits that period. Correct. So that temporal resolution is very, very important. The time factor in imaging is important when there is persistent cloud cover over a which offer very limited clear view of the Earth's surface. Then there is lived phenomena, like I just told you, like floods and oil spills, which have to be imaged. Then there is multi-temporal comparisons that we need to do. The spread of forest diseases over a period of time. So from 2009 to 19, how much of forest area has decreased? What kind of land use has changed? No, all that is multi-temporal comparisons. The changing appearance of a feature over a period of time can be used to distinguish with such kind of revisit and temporal resolutions. This brings us to something known as the multispectral scanning. Many electronic remote sensors, they acquire data using scanning systems which employ a sensor with a narrow field of view. So that instantaneous field of view that I was telling you, that B part that we had seen in the image, at times it is very narrow, that sweeps over the terrain to build up and produce a two-dimensional image of the surface. Scanning systems can be used on both aircraft and satellite platforms and have essentially the same operating principles, whether it be on an aircraft or be it on a satellite platform. A scanning system that is used to over collect data over a variety of different wavelength ranges is known as a multispectral sensor. So spectral resolution, when we were talking about, we said a sensor which can sense very fine wavelengths, and with that can also distinguish between those fine wavelengths. We call that to be high spectral resolution, and we call that scanner to be a multispectral scanner. There are two main modes of methods of scanning employed to acquire multispectral image data, which is a cross-track and a long-track scanning. A cross-track scanners can scan the Earth in a series of lines. The lines are oriented perpendicular to the direction of motion of the platform. Each line is scanned from one side of the sensor to the other using a rotating mirror. As the platform moves forward over the Earth, successive scans can be built up, can be used to build up a two-dimensional image of the Earth's surface. Now, look at the image. The incoming reflected or emitted radiation is separated into two spectral components that is detected independently. The UV, visible, near infrared, and thermal radiation are dispersed to their constitute wavelength. Now, you see, this is the rotating mirror. This, is rotating continuously and helping the scanner to actually scan the image this way. Satellite is moving this way. The satellite is moving this way, but the image is taken this way. So that's an across track scanner. So the bank of internal detectors, which is B, which is there here in this part, can each sensitive to a specific range of wavelength detect and measure the energy for each spectral band, and then as an electrical signal they are converted to digital data and recorded for subsequent computer processing. So in short, there is nothing but the satellite is moving this way, and I have this rotating mirror which is helping the sensor to image the earth's surface in this direction. That is across track scanners. Coming to along track scanners are also use the forward motion of the platform to record successive scan lines and build a two-dimensional image of the earth's surface which is perpendicular to the flight direction. However, instead of a scanning mirror, they use a linear ray of detectors. There's a line of detectors that are located at the focal plane of the image by the lens systems, which are pushed in the flight direction, which is along the flight direction. These systems are also referred to as push broom scanners, as the motion of the detector array is along with that of the satellite. Each individual detector measures the energy of a single ground resolution cell, and thus the size and the instantaneous field of view of the detectors determines the spatial resolution of the system. A separate linear array is required to measure each spectral band or channel. For each scan line, the energy detected by each detector of each linear array is sampled electronically and digitally recorded. Let's talk about certain advantages and disadvantages of along track and across track scanners. Along track scanners, when it comes to advantages, the array of detectors combined with the push broom motion allows the detector to see and measure the energy from each ground resolution for a longer period of time. This allows more energy to be detected and improves the radiometric resolution. So the increased dwell time also facilitates smaller IFOVs, which is instantaneous field of views, and narrower bandwidths for each detector. Thus, you will have finer spatial and spectral resolution, which will also not impact the radiometric resolution and will give a better image. As of the detectors are usually solid state electronic devices. They are generally smaller, lighter, requires less power, and are more reliable and last longer because they have no moving parts. On the other hand, cross calibrating thousands of detectors to achieve uniform sensitivity across the array is necessary but a bit complicated. Advantage of multispectral scanning system: the spectral range of photographic systems is restricted to the visible and the near infrared, whereas for multispectral scanning it moves beyond that and it moves into the thermal infrared, so better images. They are also capable of much higher spectral resolution than photographic systems. Multiband or multispectral photographic systems use separate lens systems to acquire each band. This may cause problems in ensuring that better bands are comparable both spatially and radiometrically with registration of multiple images. Multispectral scanning systems um, acquire all spectral bands simultaneously through one optical system to alleviate these problems. Photographic systems record the energy detected by means of photochemical processes, which is difficult to measure and to make consistent. And hence, multispectral scanning becomes easier for us because it eliminates this photochemical processes. As the multispectral data are recorded electronically, it is easier to determine the specific amount of energy measured, and they can record over a greater range of values in a digital format. I hope till now a cross track, a long track, and multispectral scanning systems have been clear to you. A long track and a cross track shall be a bit confusing in the first part, but successive reading of this will help you better understand both of these. Apart from that, multispectral scanning system has a very basic idea, which is nothing but finer the wavelengths being captured, better is the spectral resolution, better shall be the image, and those sensors are known as multispectral sensors. That is what is more important. That is the basic understanding of multispectral scanning. That is the basic theory that you need to understand for multispectral scanning. Next, we come to the next part of the session that we come to is thermal imaging. Now, many multispectral systems sense radiation in the thermal infrared, as well as it will also sense the radiation of the visible and reflected portions of the spectrum. As we mentioned earlier, it takes in both visible, reflected infrared as well as thermal infrared. All these. However, remote sensing of energy emitted from the Earth's surface in the thermal infrared is different from that of the reflected energy. So, there are certain thermal sensors. These thermal sensors use photodetectors sensitive to the direct contact of photons on their surface to detect emitted thermal radiation. The detectors are cooled to temperatures close to absolute zero in order to limit their own thermal emissions. Thermal sensors essentially measure the surface temperature and the thermal properties of the targets. So, thermal we know is related to temperature. So, thermal properties of the target can be detected by through this process of thermal imaging. Thermal imagers are typically across track scanners. These sensors employ one or more internal temperature references for comparison with the detected radiation so that it can be related to the absolute radiant temperature. The data that is recorded on a film or a magnetic tape, and the temperature resolution of the sensors may reach up to zero point 0.1 degrees Celsius. For analysis, if you look at the image, the image will show, it will be in the gray scale. The warmer temperatures will be shown by the lighter tones, whereas the cooler temperatures will be shown by the darker tones. The imagery which portrays relative temperature differences in their relative spatial locations are sufficient for most applications. Absolute temperature measurements may be calculated but require accurate collaboration and measurement of the temperature references and the detailed knowledge of the thermal properties of the target the geometric distortions, and the radiometric effects. Because of the relatively long wavelength of the thermal radiation, which when we compare it to the visible radiation, atmospheric scattering is minimum. However, absorption of atmospheric gases normally restricts thermal sensing uh, to two specific regions, which is from 3.3 to 5 and 8 to 14. But then too, it provides better, um, I should say, better information or data about the target. Because energy decreases as the wavelength increases, thermal sensors have larger IFOVs, which is instantaneous field of view, to ensure that enough energy reaches the detector in order to make reliable measurement. Therefore, the spatial resolution of thermal sensors is usually fairly coarse relative to the spatial resolution possible in the visible and reflected infrared. Thermal imagery can be acquired during the day or the night and is used in a variety of applications, especially in military, in disaster, or in the heat loss monitoring. Digital images, when a paper photograph is scanned through a scanner and stored in a computer, we call that form to be a digital image. We call it as a digital mode, correct? So in digital mode, photographic information is stored in an array of discrete numbers. Each number corresponds to a discrete dot, one image element in an image. This image element is the smallest part of an image and generally known as a pixel or a pel. See, be it thermal images, be it satellite imageries, be it aerial photography, digital form of aerial photography, or forms of digital images, everything is in the form of raster. And when I say it is in the form of raster, its smallest element is nothing but a pixel. So the more you zoom in, you will find squares with a distinctive color and a digital number. That is nothing but the value of the pixel, and the color of the pixel will give us the information of that area, whether it is a vegetative area, whether it is a settlement area, whether it is a man-made feature area, whether it is a natural feature area, all that. Okay, these numbers vary from place to place within the image depending upon the tonal variation. Number of pixel in an image depend upon the image size, which is the length and the width of the image. Any image, brighter areas are represented with higher values and darker areas are represented by lower values. Each of this value we call it as a digital number. An image must be converted to a numerical form before processing, and this conversion is called as digitization. At each pixel location, the image brightness is sampled and quantized. This step generates an integer at each pixel representing the brightness or darkness of the image at that point, and is represented by a two-dimensional integer array and digitized brightness value, which we call it as gray level. In short, see, the higher values white, lower values black. When we show the image in terms of black and white, we call it as gray level images. Thus, it is a digital representation in the form of rows and columns where each number in the array represents the relative value of a parameter at that point over the unit of time. This brings us to something known as digital image processing. You have a digital image, be it in terms of a satellite image or an aerial photography, you have that image. What kind of processing has to be done to derive the information is what we call as digital image processing. There has to be some analysis, some steps, and that steps will help us to interpret what is there in that image. That is called as digital image processing. Digital image processing can be defined as subjecting numerical representation of objectives to a series of operations in order to obtain a desired result. It begins with one image and produces a modified version of that image. Digital image analysis is a process that takes a digital image into something other than a digital image, such as a set of measurements of the objects present in the image. However, this term is loosely used to cover both the processing and the analysis. So it is a broader term which includes both the processing and analysis of images. There are certain characteristics of digital images, which is nothing but the spatial, spectral, and radiometric resolution, which we have already discussed. So I don't think I should re-explain that. If there's any doubt, you can ask me on once we finish off this session, when we have the doubt clearing sessions. The resolution concepts are the same. There is hardly any difference when it comes to the concepts of resolution. Now, there are certain basic concepts of digital images that you need to know, you need to be thorough with. One, the first most important comes as the digital number. And as I told you, all these digital images, they consist of pixels, the smallest unit, which we call it as pixels. Each and every pixel has a number, and that number we call it as the DN value, or the digital number. The lowest intensity is assigned the DN number of 0, whereas the highest intensity has the highest DN value. Now, what is this intensity? This intensity depends upon the brightness. Okay, so pixels pixels have their own values. These values depend upon the brightness, which we call it as DN values. Less intensity, or the lowest intensity, is 0, whereas the highest intensity has the highest DN value, depending upon which is it, 8-bit, 16-bit, whatever. Moving on to the next concept, which is pixel depth. This refers to the number of bits used to represent each pixel in the RGB space. RGB is red, green, and blue space. If each pixel component of RGB image is represented by 8-bit, then the pixel is said to have a depth of 24 bits. And so on with maybe the 16-bit, or maybe in that case lesser 2-bit, 4-bit, whatever it is. The lookup table. It gives you an output value of each of the range of index values. A lookup table is used to transform input data into a more desirable output format. And then you have bands. Bands is a very it's a very frequent term that we use both in remote sensing and actually in remote sensing in collaboration with GIS. Now, images, we all know, are obtained at different wavelengths from a multispectral image. Each of this, at different levels, is known as a band. So when it comes to something known as layer stacking in GIS, you have different bands that you have to layer stack. When you have a true color composite image or a false color composite image, you have different bands for it. So you need to be thorough with the concept of band. As I told you, the true color and the false color composite. Now, if we display three image bands of the remote sensing data acquired in the RGB spectral range, which is red, green, and blue, red, green, and blue spectral ranges, in their own red, green, and blue color guns or planes of a monitor, we call it as a true color composite. So red will be assigned red, green will be assigned green, blue will be assigned blue. Then we call the resulting image to be true color composite. However, when we come to the false color composite, the display color assignment for any band of a multispectral image can also be done in the other form, in an entirely different form. In this case, the color of a target in the displayed image does not have the resemblance to the actual color. True color composite, what will happen? Green, vegetation, blue, water. It will be that. But when it comes to false color composite, your true colors will not be determined or will not be seen in a FCC image, which is a false color image. There'll be different other schemes. See, vegetative area will be in red color. Your settlement areas will be in a light bluish color. So this is not actually your true color which you see on the earth's surface. Okay, so that is known as a false color composite. So maybe a red plane, the monitor will be assigned green band, or a green band will be assigned blue band, and blue band will be assigned red band. Then that will give you a FCC image. It will not give you a true color composite image. When it comes to processing all these digital images, when it comes to having a certain analysis and processing done on the digital images, there are four important processes. The first comes the image pre-processing step. It is usually necessary to pre-process all the remote sensing data prior to analysis, because the image data recorded by the sensors, they have certain errors which may degrade the quality of the image and cause the image to appear a bit noisy, blurred, or distorted. So there are certain steps that you need to um, do, such as geometric correction and such as atmospheric corrections or geometric or radiometric corrections to nullify all these errors that had been recorded. All these errors are corrected using suitable mathematical models at the stage of pre-processing. The next step comes as image enhancement. Image enhancement is carried out to improve the appearance of certain image features to assist the human interpretation and analysis. So steps like histogram equalization. When it comes to two different images of the same, you want to bring it to the same equal position, or then you have I should say histogram stretching to proper appearance of the image character, the targets being shown on the image. So image enhancement steps highlights image features for interpreters, whereas image processing steps reconstructs a relatively better image from an originally imperfect or degraded image. So there's a difference between image pre-processing and image enhancement. Image pre-processing is major removal of errors. Image enhancement is you make things more clearer for interpretation. The next thing that comes in is image transformation. Image transformations are operations similar in concept to those of image enhancement. However, unlike image enhancement, operations which are normally applied only to a single channel of data at a time, image transformations usually involve algebraic operations of multi-layer images. So it may be addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, applying certain algorithms, exponentials, or in that case also trigonometric functions that can be applied to the original images to be transformed into say new images for better and highlighted features in the image. So it's the same kind. Enhancement and transformation is it of the same kind, where transformation is a bit advanced, where you have certain mathematical models that can be applied, like algebraic operations that can come in, which is subtraction, addition, trigonometric functions, etc. The last that comes in is the thematic information extraction. This includes all the processes used to extract the thematic information that is present in the images. Image classification is one of those processes of thematic information derivation. classification such as the land use land cover. I can do it through supervised, through unsupervised, or through hybrid classifications. So there are different levels of image classification also when it comes to uh, image classification, and it depends upon the purpose. At times I think, okay, unsupervised classification will do for this project that I have taken up, so then I take unsupervised. But then if I want major furthermore classes where the computer cannot detect when it comes to unsupervised, okay, then I will do supervised. But then I need further more classification. See, for my supervised I will take as, see, for land use land cover, for supervised classification I will have 5 classes. I will have settlements, built up area, I will have water, I will have say vegetated area, cultivated area. So these are 4 classes that I have. But again, within my forested area, I want high density, low density, and say low, medium, and high. So then for that I will require hybrid classification. So depending upon my purpose, my image classification techniques will differ. So with this, I would end my session over here. Um, when it comes to these processes like image pre-processing, enhancement, transformation, and information extraction, we will look into the practical part in the practical sessions that will give you a better understanding of these concepts. I have generally taken all the information from certain textbooks. This is available online. You can definitely go through the textbooks that I have written here. These are quite easy, and you'll be able to understand better. I would request and I would want you to read through a lot of this across track, a long track, these digital image processing techniques, so that it becomes easier for you to understand what has to be employed for the project that you will be taking up in future. With this, I end the session here. I open the forum for your doubts. If you have any doubts, please do ask. We will reply either in the chat box, or we'll reply to you just the way I did right now. Like, we'll just have a normal digital call on it so that your doubts can be cleared. So thank you, and please post your doubts. We'll get back to you with your clear